The sun was a white-hot hammer, beating down on the dust-choked plains of the Mercer territory with a relentless, punishing fury. It was a land where the horizon shimmered with heat hallucinations, turning the distant mesas into shifting, ghostly fortresses. The only sound for miles was the rhythmic, tired groan of a rusted windmill, a metallic shriek that sounded like the land itself was crying out for a drop of water. But today, the windmill wasn't the only thing suffering under the unforgiving sky. Tied to a skeletal, fallen oak tree, less than 100 yards from the sprawling, wealthy Mercer ranch house, was a woman. She was close enough to hear the water splashing in the troughs and close enough to smell the roasting beef from the main kitchen, but she was bound tight, left to wither in the dirt. Her name was Evelyn, and her belly was rounded with a life that hadn't even begun to see the cruelty of the world. The ropes were brand new, biting into her swollen wrists with intentional, cold precision. She wasn't hidden away in a cellar, she was an exhibit, a living warning to anyone who dared question the absolute authority of Silas Vane, the man who claimed to own the land, the law, and the people on it. Elias appeared on the road like a ghost conjured from the dust. To any casual observer, he looked like the very definition of a man who had lost everything. His clothes were a patchwork of sun-bleached burlap and stained leather, his beard was a silver thicket matted with the grit of 3 states, and his boots were held together by sheer willpower and bits of twine. He moved with the slow, heavy gait of a man who had walked 1,000 miles and expected to walk 1,000 more. He carried nothing but a tattered bedroll and a canteen that rattled with more air than water. He looked like a beggar, a drifter, someone the world had decided to forget. But as he crested the hill and saw the woman tied to that dead tree, his pace didn't quicken with the frantic panic of a weak man, instead, it steadied with a terrifying, quiet focus. He didn't look like a savior, he looked like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, silent and heavy with a coming reckoning. As Elias approached, his long shadow falling over the parched, yellow grass, Evelyn stirred. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes clouded with the onset of heatstroke and the salt of dried tears. She looked up at the man in rags and didn't see hope, she saw another predator, another person sent by Silas to mock her or finish the job. "Don't do that, please," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. It wasn't a scream for help. It was the sound of a spirit that had already been broken by hours of shouting and pleading. She expected him to laugh, to spit on her, or to take what little dignity she had left. Elias didn't speak a word. He took off his battered hat and placed it on a nearby fence post where she could clearly see his face, a face etched with a history of storms, battles, and a deep, ancient weariness. He set his canteen down on the ground, not forcing it on her, but leaving it within reach of her bound hands, a silent offering of respect. He knelt by the tree, the rough, dry bark scraping against his calloused knees. He didn't need to ask who had done this. The M brand on the cattle grazing in the distance told him everything he needed to know about the Mercer cruelty. He pulled a small, unassuming folding knife from a hidden pocket in his rags. The steel didn't glint like a hero's silver blade, it was dark, worn, and practical. As he reached for the ropes, Evelyn flinched, her breath hitching in her chest as she braced for a blow. "I'm cutting you loose," Elias said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder vibrating through the earth. "Steady now. I'm not here to hurt you." He worked the blade with a surgeon's precision. These weren't just knots, they were the work of a professional, designed to tighten with every struggle. When the last strand finally snapped, Evelyn collapsed forward, her arms heavy as lead. She immediately shielded her stomach, a mother's instinct surviving even when her hope hadn't. Elias backed away, giving her the space she needed to breathe, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for movement. He noticed the boot prints in the soft silt around the tree, heavy, arrogant heels that had paced in circles. Someone had sat nearby and watched her suffer, enjoying the spectacle. Just then, the distant thud of galloping hooves shattered the silence. A group of riders, led by a man in a tailored silk vest and polished silver spurs, thundered toward them. It was Silas Vane himself, flanked by his hired thugs. He skidded his horse to a halt, kicking up a choking cloud of grit over the homeless man and the broken woman. Silas looked down from his high saddle, his hand resting on the pearl handle of his revolver, a sneer twisting his handsome, cruel face. He saw a beggar touching his property, and he saw a woman he thought he had discarded. He didn't know that the man in the rags was the most dangerous thing he would ever encounter. Silas Vane sat atop his high-bred stallion, a beast as black as a coal mine and twice as temperamental. He looked down at Elias with the kind of curated disgust one usually saves for a cockroach found in a silk-lined drawer. "I asked you a question, vagrant," Silas barked, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man used to being obeyed without hesitation. His riders chuckled behind him, a low, sycophantic sound that filled the dry air. "Do you have any idea whose land you're trespassing on? Everything the light touches here belongs to the Vane name. That woman included." He gestured dismissively at Evelyn with a gloved hand, as if she were a piece of livestock that had simply wandered through a broken fence. Evelyn was shivering despite the blistering heat, her body racked with a deep, systemic chill that came from sheer terror. She was huddled under the tattered coat Elias had placed over her shoulders, a garment that Silas now glared at with a curled lip. To Silas, the coat was a piece of filth, a literal stain on his property. "You're polluting my air with your very presence," Silas hissed, leaning forward in his saddle. "Pick up your trash and get moving before I decide to use you for target practice. The crows in this county are hungry, and I'm feeling charitable enough to give them a meal." Elias stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and devoid of the frantic energy of a man in fear. His joints didn't pop or creak as one might expect from a homeless drifter. Instead, he moved with a fluid, dangerous grace that seemed entirely out of place for someone in his position. He looked Silas directly in the eye, not with the hot-headed defiance of a youth, but with a chilling, practiced lack of fear. It was the look of a man who had stared down wolves and found them wanting. "The land belongs to the Creator, Silas," Elias said quietly, his voice a low vibration that seemed to carry further than Silas's shout. "And the woman belongs to herself. You've used a brand new rope to tie a pregnant woman to a dead tree. That's not a man's work. That's the work of a coward who's afraid his own shadow might outshine him." The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke. The riders stopped laughing. No one spoke to Silas Vane in that tone, not the sheriff, not the mayor, and certainly not a man who looked like he'd crawled out of a dry wash. Silas's face turned a deep, bruised purple, the veins in his neck bulging like thick cords. Without a word, he uncoiled his heavy leather whip from his saddle horn. The leather whistled through the air, a sharp, predatory sound. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about status, old man," Silas hissed. With a sudden flick of his wrist, the whip lashed out, aiming with cruel precision for Elias's face. But then, the world seemed to slow. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't duck or raise his arms in a desperate attempt to shield himself. Instead, his hand shot out with the blinding speed of a striking rattlesnake, catching the tail of the whip mid-air, just inches from his eyes. The force of the pull was so immense that it nearly yanked Silas right out of his expensive leather saddle. The homeless man held the leather tight, his knuckles white, his eyes boring into Silas's soul with a weight that felt like a physical pressure. "I've seen better men than you swing from shorter ropes, Silas," Elias whispered. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. The quiet authority in his voice was more terrifying than any scream. Elias let go of the whip with a sudden jerk, causing Silas to recoil and almost lose his balance. The riders moved their hands toward their holsters, but Silas raised a shaking hand to stop them. He was humiliated, and in the West, humiliation was a wound that bled faster than a bullet hole. "Take her and go," Elias told a passing farmer who had stopped his wagon at a distance, watching the scene in frozen terror. Elias helped Evelyn into the wagon with the gentleness of a father, ignoring the 3 revolvers currently pointed at the back of his head. He knew Silas wouldn't shoot him, not yet. Men like Silas wanted a stage for their cruelty, they wanted an audience. "This isn't over, drifter," Silas promised, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and newfound uncertainty. "You'll be begging for that tree before the sun sets tomorrow. I'll make sure there isn't a square inch of this territory where you can hide." Elias watched the wagon roll away toward the town of Cheyenne, where a doctor might be able to save the life Silas had tried to discard. He turned his back on the Mercer ranch and began the long walk toward town. He wasn't running, he was marching. As he walked, he reached into a hidden, reinforced pocket inside his rags and felt the cold, hard weight of a heavy silver coin. It wasn't currency, it was a symbol of a life he had walked away from, a life of power, law, and iron-fisted justice. He looked at the dust on his calloused hands and knew that to save the innocent, he would have to become the man he used to be. Cheyenne was a town built on the backbone of vain money, and it wore that wealth like a suit of armor that had begun to rust from the inside out. The buildings were grand, with fresh paint and ornate boardwalks, but the people walked with their heads down, their eyes darting nervously as if every shadow held a debt collector. When Elias limped into the town square, his appearance drew immediate and sharp scorn. Shopkeepers shooed him away from their porches with broomsticks, well-dressed ladies pulled their skirts aside to avoid brushing against his filth. He was the homeless intruder who had dared to strike back at the town's benefactor, and in Cheyenne, a sin against Silas Vane was a sin against the town itself. Elias ignored the sneers, his eyes fixed on the modest shingle of the local infirmary. He moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to baffle the onlookers, a man who had nothing, yet walked as if he owned the very air he breathed. He found his way to the small room where Evelyn was being treated. The air inside smelled of carbolic acid and old wood. Dr. Miller, a man whose hands shook with a nervous tremor, was busy bandaging Evelyn's raw, bloody wrists. He looked up as Elias entered, his face pale. "You shouldn't be here," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "Silas has already sent word ahead. The sheriff is coming for you. They're calling it attempted robbery and unprovoked assault. You've stirred a hornet's nest, old man, and in this town, the stings are fatal." Elias didn't seem to hear the warning. He sat on a wooden crate by the bed, his presence filling the cramped room with a strange, calming weight. He looked at Evelyn, whose eyes were finally clear. "How is the child?" he asked. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of the tattered coat he had given her. "The doctor says he's a fighter," she said, a spark of life returning to her gaze. "Just like you." The moment of peace was shattered when the heavy doors of the infirmary swung open, crashing against the wall. Sheriff Dalton, a man whose badge was as tarnished as his soul, stepped in, flanked by 4 deputies with their hands on their gun belts. Dalton was a man who had sold his integrity long ago for a steady paycheck from the Mercer ranch. "Elias Thorne?" the sheriff asked, though he didn't care for the answer. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Silas Vane and the theft of Mercer property." He pointed a thick, accusing finger at the coat Evelyn was wearing. "That's evidence of your thievery right there. Take him." The deputies moved in, eager to prove their worth to their true boss. They expected a struggle, perhaps a desperate plea for mercy from a man with no status. What they got was a lesson in silent humility. Elias didn't fight. He didn't even stand up until they reached for him. He held out his hands, his wrists steady and unshakable as the iron cuffs clicked shut. "Justice has a funny way of finding the right house, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tension like a cold wind. "Make sure you're ready when it finally knocks on yours." They marched him through the streets, a public display of Silas Vane's power, and threw him into a cell at the back of the jailhouse. The room smelled of damp earth and the lingering despair of the men who had occupied it before him. Elias didn't pace the small space, he sat on the floor, his back against the cold stone wall, looking like a man who was exactly where he needed to be. An hour later, the rhythmic click of polished boots announced the arrival of Silas Vane. He stood outside the bars, dressed in a fresh charcoal suit, a cigar smoldering in his hand. He looked down at Elias with a triumphant, jagged smile. "You see, old man. Status is everything in this world. I am the law here. I am the gold. I am the very breath this town draws." Silas leaned in close, the smoke from his cigar drifting into the cell. "Tonight, we're going to have a little unfortunate accident in this jail. A fire, perhaps. Or a tragic hanging by a man overcome with guilt. No one will miss a drifter who shouldn't have been here in the first place. Elias didn't look up, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You keep talking about what you own, Silas," Elias said, his voice echoing in the quiet cell with a haunting resonance. "But you've forgotten the most important rule of the West. You don't own the dirt until you've bled for it. And I've bled for every inch of this territory long before you were even a thought in your father's head." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound that lacked any real mirth, and turned to walk away. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he didn't notice Elias looking toward the window. Across the street, in the telegraph office, a rhythmic tapping had begun, a message Elias had authorized hours ago, destined for a place Silas Vane could never reach. The smell of kerosene arrived like a silent assassin, creeping under the heavy oak door of the jailhouse long before the first spark was struck. Silas Vane was not a man of his word when it came to honor, but he was a man of his threats when it came to cruelty. Outside the bars, the heavy footfalls of the deputies faded into the distance as they made themselves scarce, following Silas's orders to be anywhere but here, for the next hour. A single lantern, placed precariously on a stack of dry hay in the hallway, was kicked over by a retreating shadow. The glass shattered, and the flame leaped upward with a hungry, predatory roar. Within minutes, the old wood of the Cheyenne jail began to scream as the fire consumed the oxygen, turning the small building into a kiln. In the cell neighboring Elias's, a young boy named Toby, arrested only hours earlier for stealing a single loaf of bread to feed his sisters, began to wail. His thin hands gripped the iron bars, his face pale with a terror that no child should ever know. "Somebody help. Please. We're gonna burn," he shrieked, his voice breaking as the thick, black smoke began to swirl around the ceiling like a gathering storm. Elias stood up. He didn't cough, and he didn't panic. The heat was a physical wall, pressing against his skin, but he moved through the small cell with a terrifying, calculated focus. He wasn't a man trapped, he was a lion who had simply been waiting for the cage to rust. He didn't waste time calling for the sheriff, he knew the law had already abandoned them. Instead, Elias turned to the back wall of his cell. He ran his calloused hands over the stones until he found what he was looking for, a patch of masonry where the mortar had been weakened by decades of rising damp and poor repair. With a grunt of effort that sounded more like a primal roar than a human cry, Elias drove his shoulder into the wall. The impact would have shattered a normal man's bones, but Elias didn't even flinch. He hit it again, then a third time, until the stones gave way, tumbling into the alleyway behind the jail. He didn't run for his own freedom. He stepped back into the burning hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The keys were hanging on a peg just out of reach of the cells, mockery left behind by the fleeing guards. Elias reached through the licking flames, his skin blistering as he snatched the iron ring. He unlocked Toby's cell just as a support beam collapsed, sending a shower of sparks across the hallway. The boy was frozen in fear, unable to move. Elias scooped the child up, shielding Toby's small body with his own tattered coat, the same coat Silas had called filth. He didn't go out the back, he walked straight through the front doors, kicking them open with a force that sent them flying off their hinges. He emerged from the inferno like a vengeful spirit rising from the depths of the earth, covered in soot, eyes burning with a righteous fury. A crowd had gathered in the town square, not to help, but to witness the unfortunate accident Silas had promised. Silas stood at the very front, a handkerchief pressed to his nose, a look of feigned tragedy plastered across his face. When Elias stepped out of the smoke, carrying the boy, the crowd gasped in a collective shock. The homeless man wasn't dead, he looked more alive than anyone in the square. He walked straight up to Sheriff Dalton, who was standing beside Silas, his hand trembling on his holster. Before the lawman could utter a single word, Elias reached out and ripped the silver badge right off the sheriff's chest. "You aren't fit to wear the tin, Dalton," Elias said, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire like a scythe. "And you aren't fit to walk the streets of the territory I built. Arrest him." Silas screamed, his mask of civility finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He's an escaped convict. He's dangerous. The deputies, spurred by a mix of fear and the promise of Silas's gold, began to circle Elias. But the townspeople were shifting. They saw the vagrant holding the child he had saved, and they saw their wealthy benefactor standing by as the jail burned. The tension was at a breaking point, a powder keg waiting for a match. Just then, the sharp, piercing whistle of a steam engine cut through the air, a special federal transport that didn't usually stop in a backwater town like Cheyenne. A group of men in dark, charcoal suits, carrying high-powered rifles and wearing the gold and blue insignia of the Federal Circuit, stepped off the train before it had even fully halted. They moved with a military precision that silenced the square instantly. At their head was a man with a stern, granite face and a long black duster. He walked through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea. He ignored Silas. He ignored the sheriff. He walked straight to Elias, who stood soot-covered and defiant. The federal agent stopped, removed his hat in a gesture of profound respect, and bowed his head. "We received your wire, Commissioner. The Bureau of Land and Justice is at your command. Tell us who needs to be hung." The silence that followed the word, "Commissioner," was so absolute it felt as though the very wind had stopped breathing. The crackling of the dying fire at the jailhouse was the only sound in the Cheyenne town square. Silas Vane's face, previously a mask of arrogant triumph, underwent a grotesque transformation. It drained of color, turning a ghostly, sickly white that made his expensive silk vest look like a burial shroud. "Commissioner," he stammered, his voice losing its thunder and becoming a high-pitched, pathetic rasp. This man is a vagrant. He's a trespasser. You've made a terrible mistake, Agent. He attacked my men. He's a criminal." The lead federal agent, a man named Henderson whose eyes were as cold as mountain flint, didn't even acknowledge Silas's existence. He stepped forward and took the soot-stained, bent sheriff's badge from Elias's hand with a gesture of solemnity. "Elias Thorne isn't a vagrant, Mr. Vane," Henderson said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "He is the Territorial Commissioner of Land and Justice, appointed by the President himself. He is also the majority shareholder of the Union Pacific expansion, which, if my maps are correct, owns the very ground your empire is built on. You haven't been talking to a drifter, you've been talking to your landlord." Elias wiped the black soot from his brow, his eyes finally losing the weary, half-lidded look of a beggar. They sharpened into the gaze of a high judge, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and remained unbent. "I spent 20 years building the foundations of this territory, Silas," Elias said, stepping toward the shaking rancher. "I retired because I wanted to see what kind of world I'd left behind. I wanted to know if the law I wrote was protecting the weak, or if the monsters had simply moved into the big houses and started wearing suits." He paused, the weight of his presence making the armed deputies lower their rifles in shame. "I've spent the last month walking these roads as a beggar. I've seen how you treat the hungry. I've seen how you use your wealth as a whip. And today, I saw what you did to Evelyn. You thought because I had holes in my boots, I had no power. You thought because she was alone, she had no voice." The crowd, which had lived in fear for a decade, began to murmur. One by one, voices rose from the shadows. A blacksmith spoke of land stolen through forged signatures, a widow spoke of a well poisoned to force a sale, a young man spoke of a brother beaten for asking for fair wages. The instant karma was no longer a hidden hope, it was a physical force. Elias turned to Henderson. "Audit the Mercer deeds immediately. You'll find that Mr. Vane hasn't paid a cent in territorial land taxes in 5 years. He's been pocketing the town's infrastructure funds. And check the ropes in his barn. I want a forensic match to the fibers I cut from that fallen tree." Silas tried to bolt toward his carriage, but his own hired riders, sensing the total shift in power, didn't move an inch to help him. They stepped aside with disgusted looks, letting the federal agents close in. "You can't do this. Silas yelled as the cold iron cuffs clicked onto his wrists, the very same cuffs he had ordered for Elias. I have friends in high places. I have influence. Elias leaned in, his voice a chilling whisper that silenced Silas's screams. I am those high places, Silas. Or I would have been your friend, if you'd shown even an ounce of mercy to that girl. But you chose greed over grace. Now, you'll choose a cell over a mansion. As Silas was dragged toward the waiting train, the townspeople didn't just cheer, they surged forward, not with violence, but with a newfound pride. Elias turned his attention to the cowering Sheriff Dalton. The jail is a ruin, Dalton, Elias said, gesturing to the smoldering remains. I suggest you use your own hands to clear the rubble. And when the new one is built with honest timber, you'll be its first resident. You're under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Elias then walked to Evelyn, who was watching from the infirmary porch. He took a heavy leather pouch from Henderson and handed it to her. This is the back pay Silas owed this town, and a trust for your child. You're going to run that ranch now, Evelyn. It's time the Mercer land was owned by someone who knows the value of a life. A week had passed since the Great Fire of Cheyenne, but the air in the town didn't smell of smoke anymore, it smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. The oppressive cloud that had hung over the streets for a generation, a cloud woven from Silas Vane's greed and the town's collective fear, had finally evaporated. The Mercer Ranch, once a fortress of exclusion and cruelty, had been transformed. Its gates were no longer locked. Under the temporary stewardship of Evelyn and a board of the town's most honest tradesmen, the ranch had become a sanctuary. The cattle were being fed, the workers were being paid in gold rather than company scrip, and the M brand was being replaced by a new mark, a rising sun. Silas Vane sat in a federal cell 300 miles away in a high-security territory prison, awaiting a trial that the newspapers were already calling the reckoning of the century. His vast fortune, built on the backs of the broken, was being liquidated to pay back the families he had swindled. His name, which once commanded a terrified silence in every saloon and church in the county, was now a punchline, a cautionary tale about the man who tried to hang the law and ended up catching himself in the noose. Sheriff Dalton, true to Elias's word, was currently part of a labor gang, his soft, corrupt hands finally learning the weight of a sledgehammer as he helped clear the rubble of the jailhouse he had let burn. Elias Thorne stood on the platform of the Cheyenne station, watching the steam rise from the iron horse that would carry him toward the next horizon. He was no longer dressed in the grime-streaked rags of a vagrant, but he hadn't returned to the stiff, uncomfortable silks of his high office either. He wore a clean, rugged duster of heavy canvas, a sturdy wide-brimmed hat, and boots that had been polished but were clearly meant for the long miles ahead. He looked like the man he had always been in his heart, a guardian of the frontier, a man who belonged to the wind and the dust as much as he belonged to the halls of justice. Henderson, the lead federal agent, stood beside him, holding a leather satchel filled with reports and official seals. The president is anxious for your return, Elias, Henderson noted, a rare smile touching his lips. Washington feels like a very small place after witnessing what you did here. You could have a cabinet position by the end of the month. You've proven that your name still carries more weight than any army. Elias looked out toward the distant mesas, where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and molten gold. Washington is a place for men who love the sound of their own voices, Henderson. I prefer the sound of the truth, even when it's whispered in a jail cell or a dry wash. Evelyn walked up to the platform, her steps confident and her head held high. She was glowing with a health that seemed impossible only a week ago. She held a small, carefully wrapped bundle, a gift for the man who had seen her when the rest of the world chose to look away. The town wanted you to have this, she said, her voice steady and warm. It's a new coat, hand-stitched by the women whose husbands you brought home from Silas's mines. They said a man who carries the weight of the territory on his shoulders shouldn't have to worry about the cold. Elias took the coat, his rough fingers brushing the fine wool. For the first time, the stone-faced commissioner looked truly moved. Dignity isn't a gift, Evelyn, Elias said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. It's a birthright. Silas didn't take yours, he just made you forget where you tucked it away. You're the law on that ranch now. Make sure the next traveler who walks past your gate finds a cup of water and a fair shake, no matter what color his skin is or how many holes are in his boots. The train gave a final, mournful whistle, a signal that the moment of departure had arrived. The townspeople of Cheyenne had gathered in a great, silent semicircle around the platform. There was no cheering, no boisterous shouting, only a profound, vibrating respect. They had seen a miracle of social justice. The lowest among them had been revealed as the highest, and in that reveal, they had all been elevated. As Elias climbed the steps of the passenger car, he didn't look back to gloat or to bask in the admiration. He sat by the window and watched the town fade into the distance. He reached into the pocket of his new coat and pulled out a small, frayed piece of the brand new rope he had cut from the fallen tree on that first day. He looked at it for a long moment, a reminder of how easily a man can use his status to bind others. Then, as the train picked up speed, he held the scrap of fiber out the window and let it go. The wind caught it instantly, whisking it away into the vast, unforgiving, yet beautiful wilderness of the West. Elias Thorne was moving on. There would be other towns, other bullies, and other people in need of a miracle. And as long as he drew breath, the homeless rancher would be watching, waiting to see who deserved a hand up and who deserved a fall.